In this week's episode of Bleach the 1000-Year Blood War arc, Kyoraku takes on Sternritter X Lille Barro, Lille activates his Quincy Vollständig, and Kyoraku seemingly wins the fight using his long-awaited Bankai. Yes, rather than continue on with the battle between Mayuri and Pernida, this week the anime shifts gears and gets us started on the next major fight with a Schutzstaffel member, Kyoraku Shinsui versus Lille Barro. And this definitely feels like a big one. While Mayuri vs Pernida is a fantastic fight in its own right, this is a step up, at least in my opinion. Before us, we have the showdown between the Captain Commander of the Gotei 13 and the leader of the Schutzstaffel, two figures of immense power and authority, with Kyoraku shouldering the burden of the lives of his troops by staying behind to confront the hidden enemy stalking them from the shadows. Essentially, in order to ensure the rest of the Gotei 13 can press on ahead, the one responsible for them offers up his life. As with episode 34 before it, episode 35, Don't Chase a Shadow, adapts some difficult material. In fact, these enormous fights with the Schutzstaffel at the end of the series really are tricky business, featuring some of the biggest and flashiest moments of the arc so far, as well as some of the most anticipated. It can't be easy taking on the task of bringing Kyoraku's Bankai to life, for example. The pressure feels huge. But in regards to the episode itself, well, it's another pretty simplistic one. Aside from cutting the fights in half effectively and moving the pieces around on the board, this is another one that sticks almost totally true to the manga. There are certain sections removed here that don't have anything to do with this fight, but as far as the content focusing on Kyoraku versus Lille is concerned, that is played straight and true. There are virtually no deviations whatsoever. And I do think it's a bit of a shame that because these fights were so long in the manga, the anime isn't looking, at least not in these first halves, like it's going to add anything new to either of them. But then again, both Kyoraku and Mayuri's fights are considered to be two of the very best of the arc. If we get any changes to these final battles, I'm realistically expecting them to mostly appear in Gerard and Hashwolf's fights. I'm not sure about Askin's battle yet. That one kind of rides the line between being one of these great battles and being a bit wonky. Anyway, focusing in on the episode itself, I am pretty impressed this week. Like I said in my reaction, I'm going to be a little bit biased as I am a big fan of Kyoraku in general, but I think the team did a great job for the most part. Some of their artistic and creative choices were definitely a bit bold, and we'll get into that, but on the whole, I thought it was excellent. And it crucially got me excited to see how the second half of the fight plays out. So, as we begin our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, episode 35, Don't Chase a Shadow, as always I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read all of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire arc to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and what it took away from the source material. However, before we get started on today's video, if by the end of it you enjoyed this review and you want to see more from me and you're not yet subscribed to the channel, then please consider doing so today in order to stay up to date. It really does help out the channel, and I greatly appreciate the support on our journey to 300,000 subscribers. Let's begin the review then, and as always we'll start by taking a look at what chapters are covered in this week's episode. The pacing this week felt a little better, I think, than last time, mostly due to the lack of long-winded monologues, though there is a bit of rule explaining by Kyoraku to compensate here. But ultimately, structurally, this is a very similar episode to last week, and I imagine the next couple of episodes will probably feel the exact same. These are very faithful adaptations of long sequences of chapters that all focus on one particular event at a time, and in that way, make the episodes feel like a self-contained capsule of sorts. To that end, splitting up the fights probably does help with the pacing, though it's funny to say that when you consider back in the day, the original anime used to linger on individual fights for weeks at a time potentially. But without further ado, these are the chapters covered in episode 35. Firstly, we have chapter 640, Baby Hold Your Hand 3, Mad Lullaby number 7. Then we have chapter 644, Baby Hold Your Hand 7, Never Ending My Dream. Chapter 645, Don't Chase a Shadow, the title of this week's episode. Chapter 646, The Second Eye. Chapter 647, The Theatre Suicide. Chapter 648, The Theatre Suicide Scene 2. And finally, Chapter 649, The Theatre Suicide Scene 3. I really hope saying that title over and over again doesn't get me demonetized, but I guess we'll find out. Again, that's quite a lot of chapters for one episode, and that's bound to happen when the focus is almost solely on fighting. Back in the day, we were reading these chapters in a few minutes flat, so now that they're being adapted without any additions being made whatsoever, the episode feels incredibly lean as a result. Now that's not inherently a bad thing, though I can't help but wonder what this might have looked like had we had more episodes to play around with. Could we have seen 3 episode long fights for these Schutzstaffel battles that included a bunch of new content? It does also make me wonder how Askin and Gerard's fights will be approached in the future, likely in part 4. Will they be split into 2 episodes apiece and then alternated between like the fights we're currently watching? Because Askin and Gerard's battles aren't quite as structured or, dare I say, even formulaic as Pernida and Lille's were, though I always got the impression Kubo wanted them to be, so maybe we'll see a little bit of shifting round in the future to allow for the next set of fights to play out similarly to this with regards to episode format. Anyway, there's not too much to say about this episode structurally, so let's move on to the spoiler analysis itself, as we take a deeper look at episode 35 of the 1000 Year Blood War arc titled Don't Chase a Shadow. The episode opens with the final scene of episode 34 as the Golden Jizo sits back and rests after devouring Pernida. Mayuri bursts into a fit of diabolical laughter before the episode immediately thrusts us into the new content as chapter 640 continues. The Jizo suddenly realises something is wrong, and Mayuri looks on as enormous bulges begin to swell rapidly from inside the Jizo itself. In a nice little detail, you can hear the sound of a Quincy's bow being drawn just moments before the Jizo is attacked from within. As the glee fades from Mayuri's face, the Jizo explodes in a violent display of flesh and blood before we cut away from Mayuri's battle for the remainder of the episode. This isn't quite what happens in the manga, so let's compare the two briefly. Chapter 640 opens with a single page of flashback for Nemu, showing her opening her eyes for the very first time and being greeted by Mayuri, who appears to be waving his hand in front of her face. This scene hasn't yet appeared in the anime, but I have a feeling we'll probably see it next week at some point. However, Mayuri's dialogue that follows his outburst of laughter does appear to have been cut from the episode entirely, where he speaks to Ashisogi Jizo about the decision to give birth to a creature with no teeth so as not to chew and chop up Pernida inside. I understand the anime's decision to split the fights up. Supposedly it's to create a sense that these battles are taking place at the same time, which I guess is fine, though I personally don't feel like it really adds all that much, and I do find this to be a peculiar place to cut away from the fight. I thought the team was trying to create the illusion that Mayuri had won his battle before then doing the same with Kyoraku, only to simultaneously reveal the villains are both still alive and kicking in a couple of weeks' time. A similar thing happens in the Fate Karakura Town arc, where you're supposed to think that both Harabel and Barrigan are dead, only for them to make a dramatic reappearance at the turning of the tide. Here, though, I mean, Pernida is clearly alive, so I'm not sure what the point in actually cutting away really is. And having this moment here at the start of the episode kind of makes it even more obvious that Lille is likely still alive at the end of this one, despite the episode ending in a way that does try to persuade you otherwise. Personally, I'd have just cut away from Mayuri as he laughs like a madman, but there you go. It's also a bit odd that this moment with the Jizo exploding supposedly triggers the Gotei 13 sensing Mayuri's Reiatsu fluctuating when the entire preceding battle between him and Pernida apparently didn't alert them at all. Kyoraku does note that the Reiatsu has thinned in the air, making it possible to now sense these fluctuations, but Mayuri's battle with Pernida takes place after much of the Gotei 13 has already been taken out by Lille, so I feel like things have gotten a little jumbled here. In the manga, it is Mayuri falling unconscious at the very end of the fight that Kisuke senses, which does work better in my opinion. These are only tiny nitpicks of course, but still things I noticed. As we transition back over to the Gotei 13, we find ourselves in chapter 644, as everyone notices the shift in Mayuri's Reiatsu. As the group continues to charge towards the central fortress, a line has unsurprisingly been cut here. In the manga, Kisuke asks if all of the vice captains have been taken out, only for the chapter to then confirm who is still in the running. But of course, thanks to the extended sequence from episode 33 showing Lille brutally sniping people, we know exactly which characters are still up and about. This moment was always kind of clunky in the manga, so the anime clears it up very nicely. From behind them, Lille watches the group from his vantage point, having moved locations since the last time we saw him. Although he quite clearly has the Gotei 13's entire lineup in his sights, he doesn't take a shot for some reason. What happened to the cutthroat sniper from before? All kidding aside, we do get a great look at who is still around. And what do you know? Soifon is not only currently fine, but she makes it out of this episode alive and well. This is a big change from the manga, where Soifon was completely missing from really around this point, if not a little bit earlier, until the epilogue, inexplicably removing her from the final battle entirely. This now means that she will confront Gerard along with the rest of the Gotei 13, though I'm holding out hope she joins Yushido in helping Yoroichi against Askin in the future. The following sequence plays out identically between manga and anime. Kyoraku, deciding they need to learn the identity of their attacker before he takes out any more of them, stops in his tracks, spinning round to face the sniper head on. I love that Shinji straight up calls the Captain Commander a dumbass here. Kyoraku clearly doesn't quite command the same respect that Yamamoto once did just yet, but he'll get there. As Lille spots Kyoraku, he prepares to fire. In that moment, Kyoraku activates his game, and Lille's Reiatsu then becomes visible to the captain. This is a really cool visual, again taken straight from the manga, but I always loved how it was akin to catching the glare of a sniper's scope from afar, giving away their position. However, Kyoraku is immediately sniped through the chest, the shot seemingly punching through his heart. This is a similar wound to the one received by Kyone, to be honest. One thing that's cool about the anime's depiction of the X-axis is that the injuries are way more gruesome here. As the fake Kyoraku crumples to the ground, blood pools around the gaping hole in his chest, even going so far as to stain his Shihakusho crimson. In a new shot, both Nanao and Shinji rush to Kyoraku's aid, and as I mentioned in my reaction, I feel like this makes both of them very easy targets for Lille, and considering how rapidly he was popping people left, right and centre earlier, I'm surprised they aren't sniped too. Lille might have saved himself a lot of trouble if he'd taken out Nanao here, I'm just saying. However, Lille suddenly hears a voice on the air. Someone is chanting Daruma-san ga koronda, and in the anime we are treated to this wonderful visual effect where a glittering golden Kyoraku bounds towards Lille through the darkness. Honestly, it looks fantastic, and of course it's great to see another new game of Katen KYORAKU'S. But when you consider the logistics of this scene, particularly here in the anime, it does get a little bit crazy. We know from his explanation later that Kyoraku activates this game even though he doesn't know where Lille is, so I'm not entirely sure how he's able to designate him as it, but either way he does, and at that point he catches sight of his Reiatsu, which is fine. But in the anime, Nanao thinks her captain has just been shot. And yet, as per the manga, we're later shown that she follows the real Kyoraku to where Lille is. Considering her and Shinji's reaction to the shooting, it seems likely to me that they didn't know what Kyoraku was planning, so in presumably a fraction of a second, Nanao must have realised this wasn't the real Kyoraku and vanished in her captain's general direction. Anyway, after initiating his game, Kyoraku travels to where Lille is, and as we reach the end of chapter 644, he appears immediately behind the sternritter. Now, based on the rules of the game, Lille should have been slashed here. Kyoraku attributes Lille's escaping the attack to his enemy's speed, but in reality this is the first instance of Lille opening his second eye to activate the X-axis's true nature. Either way, Kyoraku succeeds in slicing off the barrel of Lille's rifle, sending it crashing into the ground behind them. Honestly, this whole sequence is framed really nicely here in the anime. I adore many of these shots, including the one of the gun barrel embedded in the stone with Lille and Kyoraku standing behind it. Here is where the backdrop of Varvelt works the absolute best so far in my opinion, as seeing the enormous fortress behind them looks incredible, and of course the lighting is much better this week too, with both fighters on a rooftop unobstructed by the surroundings. Facing down his mystery opponent at last, Kyoraku lifts his blades, congratulating Lille on his quick reflexes. However, the Captain Commander tells the sternritter that he's taken his weapon, and next, he'll have his life. It's extremely badass and a fantastic way to start a fight. We then get the episode opening, and I just want to mention that the opening has now been updated too, just like the ending from last week. Pernida now appears uncloaked, which is a really cool detail. After the opening, we proceed immediately with chapter 645. As Lille wonders what just happened, Kyoraku ponders whether or not the Quincy has ever played Daruma-san Gakoronda before. In another exchange, taken directly from the source material, Kyoraku notes how impressed he is that Nanao managed to keep up with him. As the camera pulls back to reveal the vice captain standing watch. This was always a nice piece of development for Nanao, a character who seriously needed it at this point in the story. In the Soul Society arc, she makes a point of how much trouble she has keeping up with Kyoraku Shunpo, but here she was able to move extremely fast. As Kyoraku orders Nanao to leave, she refuses, so instead he asks her to go and tell the others to head on without them. This is again a nice exchange. Kyoraku is clearly concerned about getting Nanao into danger, but at the same time respects her enough to both know that she wants to be there and that she can handle herself. That being said, I can't help but think him sending her away to tell the others to carry on is still an effort to keep her out of harm's way from the battle as much as possible. What's always been slightly odd to me, going back to the earlier point we made about Nanao getting here so quickly considering the circumstances, is that Nanao can cross the battlefield in a matter of seconds when following Kyoraku here. It's not like she can teleport along the Reiatsu path created by Daruma-san Gakoronda, so she must move that fast herself. Yet it takes her ages, multiple chapters even, to return to Kyoraku's side, allowing him to even use Bankai in its entirety before she returns. Anyway, as Nanao leaves, Kyoraku muses that she's becoming more and more like Lisa. But Lille is all business, his to-the-point, no-nonsense demeanour working as the perfect counter to Kyoraku's foppish behaviour. Lille tells Kyoraku that they have data on the battles fought by each and every Shinigami, meaning he knows that Katen Kyokots's ability is to make children's games reality. Kyoraku then explains the rules of Daruma-san Gakkoronda to Lille, and I feel like the animation of Kyoraku moving his hand here is weirdly nice, and again the background looks spectacular. But Daruma-san Gakkoronda is fairly straightforward. Kyoraku is able to designate his target as it, after which their spiritual pressure becomes visible to him, which is what happened earlier. The craziest part about that is he's able to designate a target as it without even knowing where they are. So effectively, no one can hide from Kyoraku Shikai, which is kind of crazy. Then the game allows Kyoraku to take the shortest route to his opponent, and if they don't see him coming in time, they lose. In his place, Kyoraku leaves an illusory version of himself to distract the target, or so Lille thinks. Interestingly, Lille mentions he knows of a similar game called Chocolate Ingles, which might give some hint as to his nationality. I'm no expert at all, but it sounds Spanish to me, though I don't think Lille himself is meant to be Spanish, but perhaps originates from a Spanish-speaking country. If you have any further insight, please do let me know down in the comments. As Kyoraku and Lille continue to discuss the game, I am so happy the anime decided to adapt these particular panels exactly as they appear in the manga. The shadowy faces of both Lille and Kyoraku look absolutely amazing here and really convey just how sinister and ominous this battle is going to become. Before he can do anything about it, Lille has now been dragged into Kyoraku's shadowy hell, and the two of them are in this until one of them dies. However, as Lille notes that it was a mistake for Kyoraku to tell him the rules, Kyoraku responds with a devilish grin, accepting that you can't start a game until both players understand how it's played. I mean, the dialogue here between these two is great. When you think about it, there's just so little build-up to this battle than the one between Kyoraku and Stark, yet I think the two characters work really well off each other, and there's a much greater and more effective sense of urgency here. Kyoraku then says that Lille made one mistake with his deductions, however. The form of Kyoraku that he sniped earlier wasn't an illusion. Instead, Kyoraku was able to harden his Reiatsu into a solidified, perfect duplicate of himself and leave it there to confuse the sternritter. It is, in essence, Kyoraku himself, a second version, but an afterimage made up entirely of his power, capable of reacting realistically to the world around it, even going so far as to bleed. If anything, it feels like a less ridiculous version of Hitsugaya's ice clone from the Fate Karakura Town arc. Lille doesn't buy it, however, snarling that there is no way he would make a mistake like that, but he did. He bought into and shot the fake Kyoraku, and of course there's a reason the fake was so very convincing. In what feels like a well-earned, huge character moment, Kyoraku asks Lille if he really knows who he's talking to. Standing up straight, Kyoraku tells Lille that he's the captain commander of the Gotei 13, looking down his nose at the sternritter in a moment of raw authority and power. At last, stepping into the shoes of his father figure, Kyoraku has embraced the position he initially didn't want. And he's definitely earned it in some sense too. Talk about a trial by fire, having been thrust into the leadership role in the midst of the Soul Society's biggest crisis ever. We've talked many times before about the difficult decisions and unorthodox leadership style that has embodied Kyoraku's so far brief tenure as head captain, and here it all comes together in one big triumphant declaration. It's safe to say Yamamoto would be proud, I think. The only downside is the anime significantly, I would say, reduces Lille's reaction here. In the manga, the sternritter's eye widens in horror, but here he looks fairly unperturbed. Now, in the source material, the chapter moves from this scene straight into their fight, but the anime swaps things around a bit. Instead, we return to the Gotei 13. Nanao has, like I mentioned earlier, somehow already reached them, yet it takes her so long, it seems, to get back to Kyoraku again afterwards. Either way, we get a new line where she tells everyone that they are to move on without him, after which we arrive at the first scene of chapter 646. Shinji agrees to leave Kyoraku to it and takes off down the street, while Momo chases after him, wondering why they aren't going to lend the Captain Commander a hand. Again, this exchange is taken straight from the manga. Shinji then asks Nanao what she thinks, to which she replies that she will head back alone. In a nice moment, Shinji channels Ukitake, wondering what he would say were he with them. In a way, this moment is always a little bit bittersweet, in the sense that it would be nice for Ukitake to simply get the opportunity to be there with them, but there you go. We then get a weirdly well-animated shot of Shinji's feet as he takes a couple of steps forwards, before he then asks them to consider what Yamamoto might say if he were the one being left behind instead. And again, this is another really great milestone moment, not just for Shinji but for Kyoraku too. Here, Shinji gets to show his leadership qualities. After all, he's now the most senior Shinigami there. Were he not a Vizard, I'd say his path to the position of head captain after Kyoraku was uncontested. But with the Central 46 being the way they are, I think that role would likely go to Byakuya instead these days. But even so, Shinji's words resonate with the others. However, this is also big for Kyoraku too. This feels like the first time many of them have been forced to reckon with the fact that yes, he really is the new Captain Commander. He has a newfound position, a newfound responsibility, and they need to treat him in the same way they would have treated Yamamoto. It's really cool, and it's followed up by a great shot where the camera pulls away from Kyoraku, showing the two fighters facing off once more as the guitar kicks in and the battle begins in earnest. I actually do really like this little change around here in the anime. I think starting the fight for real after Shinji's words about Kyoraku makes a lot of sense. That being said, we now cut back to chapter 645 to continue the battle. Again, much like Mayuri vs Pernida from last week, this fight plays out very similarly to the manga, adapting it almost panel for panel. Kyoraku rushes towards Lille. As Lille snaps off the broken barrel of his rifle, Kyoraku disappears into his Shikai's game once again, attempting to use Daruma-san Gakoronda to sneak up on Lille. Again, we get to see this really cool effect, and this time, Lille himself is included, shown as a shimmering blue outline to contrast with Kyoraku's gold. I love how it looks. This time, however, Lille isn't falling for Kyoraku's ploy and twists round sharply on the spot, discovering what appears to be the real Kyoraku behind him, his swords raised. Lille blasts Kyoraku through the chest, punching a bloody hole in him, only to suddenly realise the real danger lurks behind him. A jet-black blade bursts out of Lille's shadow as the true Kyoraku emerges from the darkness, attempting to strike Lille with Kageoni after successfully stepping on the sternritter's shadow from behind. Here, we see Kyoraku smartly merging two different games together, distracting Lille with Daruma-san Gakoronda while actually using Kageoni to try and strike him. Lille catches on quick, however, and leaps into the air, flipping over and away from the blade before spotting Kyoraku and firing at him, the real captain darting out of the way of the blast. Now, the anime seems to adapt this moment slightly differently from the manga. Here in the episode, we quite clearly see Lille jumping away from Kageoni behind him and spotting the real Kyoraku in front of him before firing, but that isn't really how this works. In the manga, Lille leaps upwards and sees the real Kyoraku exiting the shadow from underneath him, as that was him trying to stab him with Kageoni, and so fires a blast into the shadow itself in order to clip Kyoraku, which is both way cooler and makes a lot more sense. I do really like this soundtrack that's playing during their clash. I think it's new for this fight, but I can't remember, to be honest. Either way, Kyoraku commends Lille in that very Kyoraku way for dodging the strike, even including a nice little reference to Stark when he mentions that no one has dodged it on the first try. Again, not overly fair in regards to Stark because Lille had data on it already, but there you go. And Lille responds as such, saying that while they have loads of information on the Shinigami have no data on them. And at the same time, Kyoraku realises that he was in fact hit by Lille's blast, a gaping hole forming in his foot. The captain muses that it isn't fair for Lille to not tell him about his abilities while he's telling him the rules of the games. And while Lille notes that he has no intention of waging a fair fight, he decides to tell him anyway, revealing himself to be Sternritter X, the X-axis Lille Barro, whose power penetrates all. Against his power, the concept of dodging means nothing at all. Again, I wouldn't have thought that was really correct. I know that's what he says in the original chapter too, but if you can dodge the X-axis, then you'll be okay. Really, what he should have said is the concept of blocking means nothing at all. As Lille seemingly snipes Kyoraku again through the chest, the real Kyoraku appears behind him, initially taking the form of a sinister shadow before materialising properly. The anime has a really cool transition here where the blood of the false Kyoraku drips down the screen, revealing the shadow behind it. Here, Kyoraku reveals another game of his Shikai, KYORAKU'S, wherein by staring at one's shadow they can project it perfectly to another location as an afterimage, which is what Lille shot. It's interesting. In his battle with Stark, Kyoraku utilised numerous games with huge variety, such as Taka Oni, Iro Oni, and Bushogoma, all abilities that seem essentially unrelated, save for the fact they're all based on games. Here, however, Kyoraku's ability set that he uses against Lille is almost exclusively themed around shadows, which admittedly is very cool. But KYORAKU'S is kind of like a quicker, lesser, but also more mobile version of what happens during Daruma-san Gakkoronda, in that Kyoraku leaves a version of himself behind. Here, though, rather than a version built perfectly out of his Reiatsu, this is just a shadowy afterimage, though one still good enough to fool Lille, exacerbated by the fact that Lille's Reikaku, the act of seeing with Reiatsu rather than one's eyes, is very powerful, a concept that is actually only introduced here in this fight. As we reach the end of chapter 645, we get this really awesome visual of a shadowy Kyoraku standing as several silhouetted children rush past in the midst of a game. One child stops, however, a young girl with a very familiar looking hairstyle, who takes Kyoraku's hand as Kyoraku explains to Lille that the scary thing about children's games is you never know when they're going to begin. As soon as a child takes your hand, you're forced to join in and play until you die. With an ominous grin, Kyoraku tells Lille that his hand has already been taken, so they may as well play until the end. The anime doesn't quite capture the pure rage on Lille's face here as seen in the manga, but it's still a very cool moment, and Kyoraku himself looks fantastic. Moving on to chapter 646, we've had the opening scene with Shinji already, so instead we move right into the next stage of the fight. In a cinematic exchange that feels so typically Bleach in a wonderful way, Lille turns his gun to Kyoraku, musing that Kyoraku thought getting in close like this would give him the advantage. With a smirk, Kyoraku confesses that he did think that, and he did have the advantage, which is why Lille has already been cut. As soon as he says this, Lille's gun breaks in two, the front half of the weapon dropping to the ground with a thud. I just love the way the gun seems to respond to Kyoraku's words, like it waits for his line before snapping in half. Like I said, it's very cinematic and cool for cool's sake. Very stylish, I love it. Diving backwards, Lille reshapes his broken rifle, creating a brand new barrel from the reishi. Revealing his weapon's name to be Diagram, Lille reveals his gun is in fact his bow. Instantly appearing behind the Sternritter, however, Kyoraku mentions that Lille has already forgotten the rules of the game. In an effortlessly cool shot, Kyoraku takes a massive swing at Lille with his sword, only for Lille to drop to the ground immediately, just dodging the swipe. Kyoraku reveals that when Lille glanced down at the ground after his gun was broken in two, that allowed Kyoraku to replace himself with a shadowy afterimage as Lille looked at Kyoraku's shadow at the same time, thereby activating KYORAKU'S. As Lille attempts to reposition himself, Kyoraku gives chase, a ghostly voice ringing out as numerous shadow clones of the captain emerge from Lille's own shadowy path. This was always a fantastic looking panel in the manga, and I love it here too. The army of shadows looming above the sternritter as he looks up in horror. I don't think this particular ability is ever named. I don't think it's KYORAKU'S, as Kyoraku is conjuring a bunch of shadows all at once that are actually giving chase to Lille. But anyway, as the shadows rain down upon Lille, the real Kyoraku emerges from the darkness and runs his blade through Lille's heart, seemingly ending the fight. Again, all of this is taken from the manga very faithfully. I've really got no complaints with how this portion of the fight is handled at all. Grimacing with Katen KYORAKU'S buried in his back, Lille slowly opens his tattooed eye at last, revealing that this is the third time he's opened it in the battle thus far. The anime adds this really creepy, gruesome sound effect to Lille's eye opening, as though it's cracking open for the first time after years of being shut. Lille explains to Kyoraku that when he opens his second eye, he's able to unleash the true nature of the X-axis, but he's only allowed to open this eye when he's in real peril during battle. The two examples given are when Kyoraku first appears behind him using Daruma-san Gakuronda, and when Kyoraku first used KYORAKU'S. It's cool that both examples are when Lille first faced the games that he hadn't known about before and didn't need to open his eye for Kageoni. I really like that the anime actually adds a shot of him opening his eye each time too. I kind of wish that the anime had gone a step further and actually shown his eye opening briefly in real time in those moments to make the audience wonder what was going on, but this is still a great addition that helps to tie it all together a bit more. Anyway, with his eye now open, Lille reveals that in the same way his shots pass through his enemies' attacks now pass right through him. And we see Kyoraku's blade slip through Lille's body like it's nothing at all. I do wonder about the logistics behind this. In the anime at least, Lille's eye clearly is not open when he's stabbed by Kyoraku, so how does he survive that initial hit? In the manga, Lille's eye is shown to be open immediately, so you could at least theorize that he opened his eye just before the shadow clones hit, but here in the anime it is very unambiguous. His eye was closed as he received Kyoraku's strike. Anyway, Lille continues, telling Kyoraku that he keeps his second eye shut as it wouldn't be fair to the sinners if he fought with it open the entire time. However, once he's opened his eye 3 times in a single fight, he's allowed to keep fighting with them open the whole time. I wonder, does opening his eye 3 times automatically activate his Vollständig, or does he decide to do that to coincide with opening both eyes? And also, as I mentioned, I think in Lille's character analysis, who exactly is setting these rules? Is it Yhwach? If so, I don't really know why he would do that, but there you go. Either way, Lille takes the time to reveal just a little bit about himself, telling Kyoraku that he is the first Quincy granted powers by Yhwach and considers himself to be Yhwach's masterpiece, the man closest to God. So yeah, the anime has retained Lille's line about being the first Quincy granted powers by Yhwach, which likely means he did receive a shrift before even Hashwolf. I'm really hoping the anime gives us a flashback for Lille and the other Schutzstaffel members at some point. Even if it's only short, these characters need more fleshing out. But, lifting his head, Lille's second eye suddenly gleams with a brilliant emerald light. The X tattoo that was once covering his eye lifts from his face and transforms into a shimmering cross, while the eye itself is completely consumed by light. To be honest, this is why I thought it was weird that Lille was holding an actual Quincy cross a few episodes back. I always thought the tattoo was meant to be his Quincy cross, since it's the conduit for his holy form, but there you go. Lille is suddenly enveloped in a huge star of green light that totally dominates the screen, Kyoraku standing before it, silhouetted by the angelic emerald glow. It's interesting that this is how Lille transforms. He doesn't emit the standard Tower of Reiatsu like most other Quincy, save for when he used his basic Vollständig in episode 26. While the star itself is clearly drawn much better in the manga, with properly defined fleur-de-lis on the tips to indicate the almost regal nature of Lille's transformation, there's no denying this does look amazing here in the episode, and the Vandenrijk's theme playing in the background is such a nice touch. As the church bells ring out and the dust clears, Lille's Vollständig is revealed, and it looks fantastic. Honestly, I couldn't be much happier with how the anime translated Zilliel to the screen. Your mileage on the actual design itself may vary, and that's of course totally subjective, but there's no denying he looks excellent here. While there is something inherently goofy and weird about how Lille looks now, the truth is, he is designed to appear like a biblical angel, a monstrous abomination that can barely be comprehended by human minds. And in that sense, I do think this works, especially later on when the rest of this form is slowly unravelled. I was initially concerned as well about him having green wings when the colour of his Reiatsu was revealed in episode 25, but to be honest, I think it works. Would an angelic, holy gold or white light have worked better? Yeah, probably, but I'm still happy with this. However, with Lille's new form revealed, Kyoraku finds himself unable to move. While this is never explained, it's almost certainly supposed to be a reference to that idea I mentioned a moment ago. As a mere mortal, Kyoraku is rooted to the spot in the face of a divine being as he looks upon him for the first time, paralysed in place. But of course, this works in Lille's favour in other ways too, allowing him to now snipe Kyoraku immediately and not miss his target. As chapter 646 comes to a dramatic end, Lille unleashes 3 blasts of the X-axis from the holes in his wings, striking Kyoraku with them all. Well, kind of. One of the shots hits Kyoraku's hat, but the other 2 land true, punching devastating holes through Kyoraku's shoulder and hip. Poor Kyoraku has been shot an awful lot in this arc. By my count, he's been shot 8 times, I think, so far, and that's not including his shadow clones, and the count is only going up from here. I've said it before, again, I think in Lille's character analysis, but I do like how Zilliel's image is very much function over form. Everything about this transformation is designed to facilitate the X-axis. Lille is no longer wielding a rifle, then he doesn't need his arms anymore. Instead, they've been replaced by numerous huge wings, each one bearing various holes within the feathers, allowing him to snipe enemies with every single one of them. Starting chapter 647, Kyoraku dashes across the rooftops, leaking a trail of blood behind him as he leaps from one building to the next, again another nice piece of animation. Collapsing against a wall, Kyoraku mutters to himself that it would have been easier if he had just died from his wounds, but someone as strong as he is won't even pass out, let alone die. This is another cool moment. I like the foreboding soundtrack that plays as the blood pools around the captain, again even staining his Hayori red. He might not be able to pass out or die, but he is in really bad shape here. Kyoraku manages to leap into the sky once more as 2 bright green blasts obliterate the tower, and I have to say, I love how the X-axis is portrayed here while Lille is in Vollständig. The green stars look so good appearing out of nowhere against the backdrop, and they flash by so fast that it really emphasises the idea that Lille is able to blink things out of existence almost instantly. Kyoraku continues to run, escaping into a nearby building, but Lille teleports in front of him. Again, I think the teleportation ability translates really well to the anime too, as Lille swirls into existence from a strange green, liquid-like shimmer. Honestly, it just looks really good, and the anime does a great job at conveying how otherworldly Lille is now supposed to look and feel. Facing down his foe, however, Kyoraku conjures a ring of blinding light around him before activating Hado 78, Zangerin, in the hopes that a Kido blade might be able to reach his enemy. Unfortunately, the anime moves so fast here that you don't get to see that Kyoraku activates this spell by drawing his swords across each other, but this still looks awesome, and it destroys the entire top of the tower. As the tower explodes, we then transition nicely to a new scene. Ichigo sends Askin skidding backwards in conjunction with the tower exploding, the two characters already engaged in a fight. This is really cool to see, though I'll admit I was selfishly hoping for a bit more. This does also mean their initial interaction from chapter 648 has been cut, which is also a bit of a shame as I like their dialogue, but it was pretty clear from the off that this would be removed, to be fair, as it involves Ichigo asking about Grimmjow. But still, it would have been nice to see Askin's singing in the rain moment. The new dialogue here, though, is very interesting in its own way, and goes a route that I wasn't expecting. Askin groans that this is exactly why he didn't want to fight Ichigo of all people. He asks Ichigo if he received any weird training or techniques from Ichibei while he spent time here in the royal palace, which, to be honest, feels like way more than I would necessarily expect Askin to know. The fact he even calls Ichibei Osho is fascinating to me. Perhaps the Daten even included information on the Zero Division as well. When Ichigo confirms he did, Askin mutters that that is why Ichigo isn't experiencing reishi poisoning, and that in itself is also very interesting. Does that mean Askin has managed to hit Ichigo with a gift ball already, but it didn't have any effect? What's even crazier, though, is Askin then says that now he knows the truth, all he needs to do is adjust the flavour. Meaning he has a way to incapacitate Ichigo, even though Ichigo is as strong as he is and has received the royal training. Somehow, just by knowing for sure that Ichigo trained with Ichibei, Askin believes he can now succeed in poisoning Ichigo. So, I'm not entirely sure how that works, but it is nice to know that Askin initially couldn't poison Ichigo so easily. Ichigo asks Askin what he's going on about, to which Askin says he was merely telling Ichigo it was going to be fatal, as he reveals 4 gift balls between his fingers. Honestly, I would really love to see more of this confrontation, but I have a feeling the next time we see Ichigo after this episode, well, he might be furnishing the floor, if you get my drift. I initially wasn't sure if they were going to include that moment at all, but the dialogue this week makes me think they are building to Ichigo's defeat here, but I guess we'll see. Anyway, returning to the end of chapter 647, we see that Kyoraku has managed to escape Lille once again, and is now resting in hiding, pondering his next move. Before we move on, it's important to note that the new Ichigo vs Askin scene actually replaced another scene that appeared in this exact spot in the original chapter. In the source material, this is when the rest of the Gotei 13 runs into Gerard at the foot of the central fortress itself. Now, this scene obviously hasn't been cut, it's likely just been moved to a couple of episodes ahead, would be my guess. I do think they will run into Gerard in this core. I think everyone is really curious about the Gerard fight in general, but we're not quite there just yet. Returning to Kyoraku, it's revealed the Kido blade had no effect whatsoever, forcing Kyoraku to the end of his rope. Let it be said that Kyoraku's Bankai has such amazing build-up to it, and this is absolutely one instance where Kubo believed his own hype, and it was totally justified. Along with perhaps Kisuke, I think Kyoraku's Bankai was by far the one everyone wanted to see the most, and now it was finally time. As Kyoraku hopes that Nanao isn't caught up in what he's about to do, he brings his swords up and points them down towards the ground. This is it. The moment. An entire trailer built itself around. At long last, Kyoraku finally says the word, Bankai. The anime returns us immediately to chapter 648 as Ichigo rushes Askin, which is the end of their initial confrontation from the manga. Suddenly, however, a strange effect washes over the two of them, shocking them both. The same effect casts an unnatural golden blanket over the rest of Varvelt as the Quincy city trembles, the Gotei 13, Orihime, Chad, and just about everyone else sensing something strange unfolding all around them. Episode 35's supplementary video this week was on KYORAKU'S Bankai, Katen, KYOKOTS, Karamatsu, Shinju, going in depth into what it can do and how it differs from the manga, so make sure to check that out, as I won't be going into too much detail here. Suffice it to say, though, that the Bankai's activation is different from the manga in terms of tone specifically. There, it envelops the world in a crushing darkness that gives those nearby the chills. But here, the Bankai coats the world in almost the complete opposite, a mesmerising gold light transporting the combatants to a kabuki theatre of colossal size. The sinister music that plays during the unveiling of this Bankai is a great touch, however, helping to make everything feel unnerving and eerie. As Lille returns to Earth, his strange priestly gown unfurls, revealing a pair of almost alien-like legs, adding to the inhuman look of his seraph form. KYORAKU appears before him, wondering if the world feels dark, lonely, and full of despair. Lille realises this must be KYORAKU'S Bankai taking effect, but as he soars into the air above, like a great winged bird, Lille comments that God's messenger never feels despair. Unleashing 6 blasts from his lower wings, Lille devastates an enormous portion of the cityscape with green explosions, severing an entire chunk of the town. This does make me wonder why Lille only released 3 blasts initially when he had KYORAKU dead to rights after freezing him to the spot upon his initial release, but there you go. Lille notes that while they don't have information on KYORAKU'S Bankai specifically, he does know that killing the Bankai's original wielder means the Bankai disappears too. And for some reason I have spent years having misunderstood this line, but it does actually make perfect sense. Lille is simply saying that if he kills KYORAKU here and now, then KYORAKU'S Bankai and its effects will vanish along with him. However, Lille is suddenly shocked to see a gaping wound appear in his side before a second one opens up in his shoulder. Horrified, he can't understand what's going on, but KYORAKU appears through the smoke, explaining that this is Act 1 of his Bankai's performance, where the two combatants share their wounds with each other. I have to say that I think KYORAKU looks extremely cool in this shot here, where he mentions that Lille won't be able to die from these injuries. Also, how comes Lille doesn't receive a wound on his, I guess you could call it a foot, after KYORAKU was also shot in the foot earlier in the fight? If it's to do with the fact that Lille wasn't in Vollständig when he gave KYORAKU that injury, then I wonder how and why the Bankai would differentiate between the two like that. I mean, I absolutely adore the imagery of KYORAKU'S Bankai. As he twists his blade, the pine trees appear behind him once more. Combined with the yellow background, it looks amazing. And of course, KYORAKU'S voice actor does a wonderful job at selling the poetic narration of the Bankai itself. As Lille regrets wounding KYORAKU initially, his body is suddenly covered head to toe in horrible black boils, which begin to bleed profusely, blood bursting from Lille's eyes and nose as he succumbs to a terrible sickness in Act 2. Following this, both fighters are plunged into the depths of an endless ocean, Act 3 forcing them to face the abyss itself as their Reiatsu is drained from them. This is the end of chapter 648, but the demonstration of KYORAKU'S Bankai continues into the next chapter as well. Back in the day, I remember thinking that the two of them would now fight it out beneath the water's surface with their power slowly being drained from them, but that wasn't what happened. Instead, Lille immediately tries to flee the water, but finds the surface only moves further and further away. I assume the water only surrounds those actively involved in the Bankai's story. Everyone who sensed the Bankai's activation earlier is likely able to carry on as normal, I would imagine. As KYORAKU admonishes Lille's disgraceful behaviour, a pair of ghostly pale hands rise up behind the captain as Katen herself emerges, wrapping her arms around him. It was always really cool that Kubo canonized the design from the Zanpakuto Rebellion arc for this particular Zanpakuto spirit, and the two of them banter back and forth briefly. Katen notices that KYORAKU'S pink kimono is torn, scolding him for wearing another woman's kimono. A nice hint towards KYORAKU'S backstory that we'll likely receive in a couple of weeks' time. I actually really like how Act 3 of the Bankai looks too. The murky green depths of the water, the surface lit by a soft golden glow that almost looks like a sunrise, it all gives it a very unique appearance. Seeing KYORAKU with Katen draped over his shoulders, standing tall in the midst of the water, always felt like seeing his Bankai's true shape to me, even though it's really the entirety of the performance, plus the trappings of the theatre itself that we've seen laid bare so far. As Lille asks KYORAKU who he's talking to, I do kind of miss KYORAKU's little smirk he flashes in the chapter, as though he almost pities the Quincy for not understanding. His face, however, covered in streaks of blood, Lille explodes into a rage as he says that no mere Shinigami's Bankai can kill him. For some reason, Lille then flies towards KYORAKU, even though his ability is explicitly ranged in nature. Either way, it makes for an awesome final scene. Sheathing his swords, KYORAKU draws a glistening white thread from his fingertips and watches as the thread of regret wraps itself tightly around Lille's neck. Presenting the final act of his Bankai's play, KYORAKU brushes past the oncoming sternritter, drawing his fingers across Lille's throat, the scene depicted in a beautiful painterly style here in the anime. A blood-red streak strewn over Lille's neck in a dramatic finale. This last move is portrayed pitch perfect here in the anime, and Lille's eyes bulge as the split in his throat opens up in a shining gold light, consuming his entire head, until the top half of his body violently explodes, popping like a balloon in the water. With his head completely destroyed, Lille's body collapses backwards and sinks into the depths of the Quincy city far below, deep into the shadows of the water itself. As we reach the end of chapter 649, KYORAKU coughs up blood before collapsing backwards into the outstretched arms of his Zanpakuto. This is a really nice moment too. To be honest, everything between KYORAKU and Katen is great stuff, but it's nice to see a Zanpakuto caring for their Shinigami in this way, even if she is annoyed by his antics. KYORAKU murmurs that perhaps using Bankai every now and then isn't so bad if it means ending up in her lap. In a really cool shot, again taken straight from the manga, Katen notes that she's glad KYORAKU won. As KYORAKU then prepares to say something to his Ohana, the episode ends. Yeah, it's a really weird place to cut the episode in my opinion. I get, again, that the anime is trying to convince us that Lille is dead, but it still feels like an unnatural place to cap things off. To be honest, this adaptation, since part 1, has often struggled with finding the right place to end episodes in my opinion, but it's ultimately not a big deal. What is funny though is the anime making it seem like KYORAKU has something important to say to Katen, but unless they add something new here next week, well, he doesn't say anything to her at all. That's it for the episode though. Before we move on to the end of this review, let's take a look at the poem for next week, which features Nemu. Or at least I think it does. That's definitely Nemu's hand in the image, but it doesn't sound anything like her to me, which makes me think it might be the younger Nemu from her incoming flashback. It does make me wonder if Nemu might disappear from the ending as well after next week's episode. Anyway, the poem reads, "My child's hand so lost, wandering in search of mine. Close but far I take your hand. Together we will walk to the end." Again, I have to wonder if maybe this is meant to be Nemu speaking to her successor, which is Nemuri Hachigo, seen only once in the series epilogue. But once again, with no Sternritter in memoriam this week, this seems like a good time to move on to the predictions for next week. Episode 36, titled Baby Hold Your Hand 2, Never Ending My Dream. So I actually was right with what I thought the episode would be called after all. So as for next week, well, I think it's fairly simple. We'll be returning to Mayuri versus Pernida for the second half of their battle. Of course, this is where Nemu joins the fray and eventually meets her brutal end, but it does promise to be an exciting one. This is really where the fight takes off in my opinion, so I'm hoping it is given the attention and care it deserves. And based on the preview images this week, the art looks kind of incredible, so I'm pretty excited. I'm more curious though about the continuation of this week's fight. Presumably episode 36 is going to open in the same way this episode opened, showing the continuation of the battle. Perhaps it will open with Kyoraku being blasted once again by Lille as he returns from the dead. But will we actually get to see the owl form? I'm not sure. If it were up to me, I would cut away as Lille's head is reforming from the light, but I mean, who knows? And what about Ichigo versus Askin? I'd love to get a little more from that battle if possible before Ichigo potentially ends up face down on the floor, but we'll see. Like I said though, there's really not too much to speculate on right now. These episodes are currently sticking very faithfully to the manga, which isn't a bad thing, but it does mean the path ahead is clearer cut than it has been for a while. And of course, if anything does change, well, I'll be pleasantly surprised. Alright everyone, that's it for today's video, for today's in-depth spoiler review and discussion of episode 35 of the 1000 Year Blood War arc titled Don't Chase a Shadow. As always, I really do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from this video as well. I really liked this week's episode. I thought it was very, very good. Again, I'm a little bit biased, but I think they portrayed Kyoraku excellently, despite the bold and surprising artistic choices taken for his Bankai. I think it actually does work really well, and I think the Bankai Katen Kyokotsu Karamatsu Shinju was done justice here. I'm perhaps even more impressed with the depiction of Lille, who I think they made look absolutely fantastic this week. Even in his strange and eldritch Vollständig, he looked really good, and the X-axis was also portrayed really well. Their small initial clash where they are darting around, firing bullets, using Katen Kyokotsu's games, all of that I thought was handled excellently. So yeah, I'm really excited to see the second part of this fight continue in episode 37. And I'm really excited to see next week how the anime closes out Mayuri versus Pernida. Will there be any changes to this fight whatsoever? Will we see Pernida's Vollständig again? Will Pernida receive any kind of a flashback? Those are the questions that I'm looking for answers to next week. Thank you so very much for watching, guys, as always, and I want to end this video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon. If you want to take that support from me another step further and support me over there on Patreon, thank you very much. By supporting me at the $1 tier a month, you can get your name in the credits of every single video just like this, and at a $2 tier or higher, you can enjoy every video I release absolutely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Okay, guys, thank you once again for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.